A moment in history and a reminder of past tensions. 25 years after the Berlin Wall was torn down, a warning of a new Cold War. Do barriers ever fall completely between old foes, and have lessons been learned elsewhere in the world? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, it appeared almost overnight, dividing friends and families, a city and a country. The Berlin Wall, standing for 28 years as a chilling reminder of the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union, until November the 9th, 1989, that is, when, in an extraordinary moment at a news conference, it was announced that all East Germany's border checkpoints were to be opened, and it seemed with immediate effect. Now, it marked a pivotal moment in the collapse of communism and paved the way for the eventual reunification of Germany. 25 years later, the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, has been leading commemorations, opening an exhibition at a memorial to the fall of the wall at one of the few surviving sections. Merkel grew up in East Germany and was among the thousands who poured into West Germany just hours after those travel restrictions were relaxed. Well, the former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev is also in town for the anniversary celebrations, and he shares credit for bringing a peaceful end to the Cold War, but remains critical of the West for mishandling the fallout from the collapse of the Iron Curtain. And he's warned that the world is on the brink of a new Cold War.
European and international politics did not stand the test of renewal of the new conditions of the global world in the post-Cold War era. One has to admit, since the creation of our format at the dawn of this century, we have never met in such a tense and dangerous environment. Bloodshed in Europe and the Middle East against the backdrop of a breakdown in the dialogue between major powers is of enormous concern. The world is on the brink of a new Cold War. Some are even saying it has already begun. And yet, while the situation is so dramatic, we do not see the main international body, the UN Security Council, playing any role or taking concrete action.
Well, joining us for the discussion today are three guests. Here with me in the studio is Karen Lucas, a journalist who grew up in East Germany and witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall. And joining us from Berlin, we have Irwin Collier, director of the John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies and a specialist on German reunification, and Steve Sabella, an award-winning Palestinian-born artist. Welcome to you all. But Karen, can I start with you in the studio? Because you were there, you were a young woman, and you got news that the border checkpoints were to open. Express to us, if you can, at that precise moment, what was going through your mind, what was going through your emotions?
I have to say, I was not in Berlin. I was in Leipzig at the time when I got the news, and a lot of my fellow students just traveled immediately to Berlin. But we not only had the Berlin Wall as a border, there was a long wall, inner German wall, so we could travel other ways. And I remember feeling very excited, but also having this moment of shock. You almost couldn't believe it, and you were a bit frightened, and you didn't know, you couldn't point the finger why you feel frightened. But I, for example, know that my dad was one of the people who helped building the wall, and I felt a bit frightened what he will feel about this. And
so you got a sense that you were leaving, almost leaving your family behind?
Yeah, I knew that would be very tough for him. We had really painful discussions, painful arguments over the summer months in our family, because I would have loved to travel with the people who escaped Germany. I would have loved to see the world while he couldn't share these visions, and so it was a real problem, a real conflict in our family. And as much as I was really looking forward to see the West, I was also a bit frightened what would happen next, because we knew the life the way we knew it, so this moment would, of course, totally
the unknown
change.
Fear
Absolutely.
of the unknown. So obviously you wanted to travel. What else did the West represent for you? Access to the West, what would it mean? What sort of dreams did you have?
As a young student, for me, it was always the dream to travel to Paris and have a romantic journey to Paris. The traveling was really a big issue for the East Germans at this moment. And you shouldn't forget that the weeks before this event, a lot of change had already happened. So we knew there would be democratic elections, the first time in life. Honecker, the party chef, the government chef, he was gone. He was kicked out. So we knew that politically there would be lots of changes, and there were round tables in the whole country. So we were hoping at this point a more democratic East Germany. We did not think of a reunification. And I think you could ask a lot of people at this time. No one was talking about reunification. In the demonstrations, they said we are one people. We belong to each other. But no one, I think, would have expected this to happen so fast.
So, come the beginning of the fall of the wall, thousands and thousands of you from the East, particularly the young people with their dreams and ambitions, flooded across the border. What remained in the East? What happened to your parents, their generation, and indeed to the lives that they'd led up until then?
I think the weeks after the opening of the wall was quite dramatic. I mean, a lot of people just left their jobs behind, left everything behind. My fellow students, for example, quite a few of them thought it would be more interesting to start a small job in the West than just keep studying and getting a diploma, for example. Everything which was in the West seemed more attractive than what we had in the East. And that, of course, led to a situation in hospitals which was quite dramatic. I remember helping out in a hospital before Christmas because there were people handicapped and elderly left by themselves. But there was the moment after the wall came down. And then later on, I think in the early 90s, the excitement was gone, and there was a lot of frustration because then people became to realize what it actually meant. It was not only the freedom to travel, but it was also, we grew up in a state of total security. We knew when we were born in this flat, we might die in this flat. And if we had this job when we were 16 or 18, we might have this job when we are 65. Of course, it's not very attractive for everyone, but it gives you an incredible sense of security. And this was gone overnight. So, for example, in the hometown where I come from, Eisenach, there was a big car factory with 10,000 people working in this one car factory. And within 2 years, from these 10,000 people, 2,000 were only left. The others just all lost their job, and I think that was very typical of the 90s.
So there was profound change was coming, wasn't it? Can I just at this juncture talk to you, Steve, in Berlin? As a relative newcomer, you've been in Berlin for 4 years. Are you picking up on this kind of weight of history that must be experienced at this moment, 25 years on? Are you feeling this from fellow Berliners as you wander around the city today?
Well, I have to say, I come from Jerusalem, which from a place that has seen another wall going up, and I live in Berlin, and to see the contrast between Jerusalem and Berlin is quite something these days. I mean, I live in a city which feels very peaceful and very unified today, even though you meet sometimes people who think of the past and they have nostalgia for the past for their own reasons. But on the other hand, the city today thrives, and if something is proven, that all walls, all these measures are cosmetic. They are dealing with side effects and they do not work. And the same thing, the wall fell down here, it's inevitable, it's going to fall down in Palestine, where Israel built the wall.
We'll come back to that a little bit later on in the programme, Steve, but thank you very much for that. And Irwin, can I just get your initial reaction to 25 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and whether the reunification experiment, if you like, has actually worked?
As the coincidence would happen, I was at a conference in Berlin exactly 25 years ago at this day in the Reichstag, walking around Berlin on this day. There are many happy faces. It's one of those memories where everyone thought the impossible couldn't happen. It happened, and it was, in the meantime, after 25 years, many adjustments have taken place. There's new generations. The students coming to the university are all born after Germany was divided, after the wall had come down. As Willy Brandt said, it's finally growing together what belongs together. Here, this is a different kind of wall that we normally think of neighbors who are at war or do not like each other separating themselves. Here was a different kind of wall. It was a wall that was keeping apart a people. And I think that was the force of history that the Berlin Wall certainly was unable to hold fast against. But, you know, it's a long haul. There's still work to do. But, you know, I'm very much surprised. I don't know any other example in human history where without the shedding of blood and without massive cuts in living standards. I've done statistical work following the careers of individual East Germans. It is very difficult to find someone whose standard of living actually fell. Now, of course, what matters for many people is the relative position. There's still a gap between average life chances of those who remain in the East and of those who grow up in the West. But one thing is clear, there was a safety net that was extended and paid for by the West German taxpayer that caught an entire economy in free fall. The other countries that went through the transition from socialism to market economies were not so lucky as the German Democratic Republic
Irwin, it's a good point. That's a very good point that you make. Billions of dollars had to be pumped into this failing economy in the east of the country from both West Germany and its allies. There's often an expression of a certain amount of resentment, therefore, that is expressed by those who came from the former West of the country, that they've propped up the East, especially at a time, of course, of economic crisis in the Eurozone, and even the great powerhouse of the German economy is faltering somewhat recently.
Absolutely. If we look now at the infrastructure of the former Western states of Germany, the bridges, the roads are in much worse shape than they are in East Germany. There was a massive upgrading of roads, sanitation systems, communication infrastructure. All of this happened in a very fast period of time, and it did crowd out that kind of infrastructure investment in the West, no doubt about it. And this is the sort of stuff that can get people, you know, at the beer table in the local pub arguing about going into the wee hours about how much gratitude does the West deserve from the East, and then from the East, how unequal life chances still are. There's plenty of room for people to be unhappy, but the objective conditions, again, I can only say, as someone who's looked very carefully at the biographies of individual citizens, economic biographies, this has been a remarkable revolution.
That moves us rather neatly onto the remarks made by Mikhail Gorbachev, referring to the possibility of us being on the point of a new Cold War. In fact, he said we might already be in it, referring particularly to the situation in Ukraine, the standoff between Russia and Western powers over Ukraine. And indeed, he said, the West has failed significantly to prevent conflict continuing in the Middle East. Just to name that region, there were other examples he used as well. But do you think he might be right? Do you think that Mikhail Gorbachev has got a point when he says that the West has failed to capitalize on that moment, that opportunity?
What I can certainly say is the world community has not been a sterling success in bringing about a transformation, peaceful transformation, adjustments that are required in the interest of human rights across the Mideast. Where I really disagree with Mr. Gorbachev is the assertion that the Ukraine problem that we see today is somehow the making of the West violating solemn agreements that were made during the time 25 years ago or a little bit afterwards when German unification was negotiated. If we look at the actual contracts that were signed and agreed to by all of the parties, there was nothing excluding the possibility of other states in Eastern Europe that wanted to join European institutions such as the EU or NATO from doing that. There were very clear limitations on how quickly NATO forces could be stationed on the territory of the former German Democratic Republic. But all of the agreements following the fall of the Berlin Wall were very limited to the status of the territory where the Soviet occupying troops were located in East Germany. The future was still to be determined.
Can I just quickly intervene, because I was in Moscow in the early 90s, in this time when there was a lot of discussion about the NATO expansion. And I do remember there was quite an arrogant attitude towards Russia. The only stories they wanted me to do as a journalist, not the only, but a lot of the stories were Yeltsin's health situation. Was he drunk? Was he doing... It was more like interesting, fun stories from Moscow. There was not serious politics they wanted. And I remember the Russians in these early 90s kept saying, don't get the NATO too close to us, don't do this, don't come to... And I do think that there was quite an arrogance of the West to ignore this, because I think the West simply didn't think they needed to deal with Russia.
Well, that's an interesting thought, and we could have another programme on that. But in the meantime, we're going to move on to some other barriers that still exist, because the Berlin Wall has indeed fallen, and others still exist all over the world. Are there any lessons, therefore, to be learned from Germany? Israel has built a separation wall in the occupied West Bank. It says it's to protect civilians from Palestinian attacks. When it's finished, it's expected to be over 700 kilometres long. And just last month, Egypt started to work on a buffer zone in the Sinai Peninsula along its border with the Gaza Strip. It began building a barrier along that border in 2009. North and South Korea are separated by what's described as the most heavily militarised border in the world. The 250-kilometre barrier was created in 1953 at the end of the Korean War. The United States border with Mexico is reported to be one of the most frequently crossed international boundaries in the world. To date, almost 900 kilometres of walls and fences have been built to deter undocumented migrants. And Northern Ireland's so-called troubles may have been resolved by the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, but so-called peace lines still separate Catholics and Protestants in Belfast. Now we go back to Steve. And Steve, I just wanted to ask you a little bit, as somebody who comes from Jerusalem and is an artist, and this image of the wall that separates, or is hoping to separate or keep out Palestinians, is what the Israelis say. That's featured very heavily in your work, and I'm just wondering if you could explain to us, as we look at some of the images from your collection of work, as to how big an impression living within close proximity to a wall, a physical structure, what sort of impression did that have on you?
Well, in Jerusalem, I've seen the wall built from scratch, and can you imagine, I mean, Jerusalem historically, how important it is as a city, and then you have the ugliest structure on earth, in my opinion at least, going up in front of your eyes. And for me, that was a major failure by Israel, because if they believe in security, the last thing you do is build a wall like this. And may I remind people, this wall is 8 to 9 meters high, and it's already probably more than 700 kilometers. And the failure being that Israel refuses to deal with the core issue, and the core issue, and I'm loud and clear about it, is the occupation of Palestine.
I think now, Steve, we can actually see a piece of your work called Settlements, 6 Israelis and 1 Palestinian, which is a very stark illustration of your work, showing 6 Israelis in underwear and a Palestinian in underwear. What were you trying to say through that work? And it must have been a bit difficult to get people to persuade people to take their clothes off.
Yeah, well, probably context in this work becomes content. I mean, ask yourself, how can a Palestinian, being me in this case, convince 6 Israelis to strip to their underwear and have them stand in almost the Holocaust range, and directly facing them is the Palestinian also in underwear. And what I wanted to say with this work, the last thing I wanted to say is the human aspect. Actually, I wanted to create a work that is visually charged and that to create a visual confrontation. When you enter that space, when you stand in the middle of the room, you have to side either with the Palestinian and give your back to the Israelis, or look at the Israelis and give your back to the Palestinian. Now, one of the mistakes, in my opinion, for this struggle is the idea of being balanced. You can't be balanced about the Palestinian-Israeli struggle. Why? Because if the Israelis are wrong, the world has to say the Israelis are wrong. If the Palestinians are wrong, then the world has to say the Palestinians are wrong.
Absolutely. Steve, can I just interrupt you there and just ask you a little bit more about the kind of the psychology of having a wall present, the psychological effect. There's been some interesting research done which suggests that people living within close proximity to such a structure actually suffer certain psychological conditions. I mean, can you talk about that at all? Have you come across that at all? And how is that expressed in your work?
Well, I have been speaking about this for many, many years. I actually said more than once what Israel and Palestine needs is actually a team of psychologists, probably 5,000 to 10,000, that should go on TV, on radio, on every magazine and just heal the nation psychologically. We are definitely entered a very bad times now. And actually, the president of Israel just recently said the Israeli society might be sick. I mean, I can't quote the right quote, and he said it needs healing. I totally agree. And I will add to this one more thing. We're not only that people are suffering psychologically, I think we have entered a new era, which is, in my opinion, the colonization of the imagination, where people are no longer able to imagine, let's say in the case of Palestinians, that they can be free. And Israelis need to get rid of this occupation because it's also sickening for them. So what I'm actually thinking today, that every Palestinian should wake up and just say, I am a free person. Because if we can't imagine we are free people, how, in the name of God, are we going to free the land?
OK, Steve, can I now turn to you, Irwin, and just get your final thoughts for this programme on Berlin, 25 years after the fall of the wall, and where you see it heading, and whether you think unity among the German people has really been achieved, and indeed whether much has changed in 25 years globally.
Sure. I think the legitimate comparison here is to look at the American Civil War that took place in the 1860s. The shadow cast between the North and the South, there are still, things that you can see in present-day United States reflecting that long division. There was nothing nearly as long and as ugly as slavery separating East and West Germany. The growing together, as I've told you, has made, as far as historical time is concerned, enormous progress. I think it's more interesting to watch at the larger European level.
Okay.
And what we are seeing with this, the start of another Cold War, is precisely this problem of Europe wanting to come together and outside forces trying to prevent some parts of Europe from joining other parts.
Irwin, I thank you for that. And Karen, can I come back to you? And on this occasion, it must be a very emotional, a very personal day for you in terms of your recollections, your memories, and thank you very much indeed for being in Doha, so you can tell us all about them.
Thank you very much.
So what sort of emotions are you going through today, 25 years on?
There is so much talk now in the last couple of days. It's almost difficult to have emotions now because we talk so much about it. But I spoke to my cousin the other day on the telephone. I said, do you go and watch it? And she said, yes, I will. And they always get me somehow. When you don't expect it, you just get very emotional and very sentimental about the past. And I think my life wouldn't be the way it got. I mean, it had such a dramatic impact on my personal life that I'm very grateful.
Karen Lucas here in Doha, Irwin Collier in Berlin, and Steve Sabella also in Berlin. Thank you all very much indeed. A really interesting conversation. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us here on Inside Story. And remember, you can add your voice to this discussion. You can leave us your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. On Twitter, our handle is @AJ Inside Story. And as we reflect on the moment the Berlin Wall came down, we'll leave you now with some images of some of the many barriers that still exist. I'm Martine Dennis. Thank you for watching.